All right, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Education in a COVID-19 World, What's Next for Education in California, sponsored by the USC Rossier School of Education. My name is Matt DeGroosh and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement at USC Rossier. Before we begin, I would like to review the process for submitting a question for our panelists. Please type your question in the Q&A box that can be accessed by clicking on the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen. We have reserved time towards the end of this webinar for your questions and hope to get to as many as possible. I would now like to turn it over to the moderator for today's webinar, Dr. David Cash, Professor of Education at USC Rossier.
Well, welcome everybody. Thanks, Matt. The context for our conversation today is really to reframe the crisis and begin looking at the solutions, moving away from just identifying and describing the problem to solving the problem, and recognizing that the historically underserved and marginalized students and families in our communities need our best work in moving forward. And to quote one of our panelists today, Dr. Gothold, we really need to double down on our efforts to serve all students, particularly those in our urban communities. And while we did a great job, millions of dollars were rallied, devices and hotspots delivered, we still have a lot of work to do. Distance learning is a reality now, and it will be in the future as well. And finally, today we'll take a quick look, an important look at the mental health of our students, our parents, and our staff, and how do we provide support to ensure that the good work they're doing continues for our communities. We've got a great panel today, and I'd like to introduce them briefly. Paul Gothold, who is the Superintendent of the San Diego County Office of Education. Wes Smith, the Executive Director of the Association of California School Administrators and a former superintendent. And Jay Westover, the Chief Learning Officer for InnovateEd. So the first question today goes to Wes Smith. How has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the political landscape in California? Local decision-making, executive orders, the role of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, etc.
Thanks, Dr. Cash, for hosting this. Thanks to Rossier for putting this on. This is exactly the kind of outreach our universities have to have right now. And to all the practitioners on the webinar, thank you the most for the work that you're doing during these unprecedented times to serve, educate, and feed our students. About the political landscape, it's turned upside down. Roles are shifting and responsibility, and this is probably the most important point for this webinar, responsibility is being shifted to the local level. More and more leaders at the local level are having to make decisions that they own and that they wear, sometimes like scarlet letters, because it's such an intense issue. Typically, the SPI and CDE would work on compliance matters. The state board would work on regulatory and governance matters. The legislature would move legislative vehicles forward, and the governor would either support them by signing them or veto them, although the governor is always involved throughout the process. But now we're seeing, because of COVID-19, things accelerate and lines being blurred. We're seeing our governor make weekly, sometimes multiple times a week, executive orders that take the place of some of those legislative vehicles, often without the legislature being noticeably involved, although we know that they're being consulted and they're in the process. I think to give them some credit though, SB 117 was a great job by California legislature. In a day, something that usually takes months and months and sometimes years through multiple sessions, they introduced a bill, approved it, put it on the governor's desk, and it got signed in one day, and it provided $100 million to California school districts. Some 13 days later, they amended it so there was greater flexibility so folks could help eliminate, to the best of their ability, the digital divide. But the legislature did a great job. But I think the important part for this conversation is really back to the governor and the executive orders, because they're not so much legal orders with the force of law. They're almost like executive guidance, if you will. As one superintendent recently said, it's like sending up a trial balloon than having us figure out where it lands. And I think the reason that's important is because, again, it's putting pressure on the local leadership to make these really, really tough decisions, and in some places, in areas not within their expertise. And this isn't to blame the governor. He believes in local decision making. He also knows that variables are different around the state. We have a very diverse state. And so he's trying to give that authority where he believes it can be best used. Still, it adds pressure to the locals. And I just wanted to mention a couple of things that demonstrate this really quickly. We know that on March 4th, the governor declared a state of emergency. 3 days later on March 7th, our first school district, Elk Grove Unified, that superintendent had to make a decision to close the first school district in California because they had a confirmed case, didn't have any support from the state, made that decision. And then later on the 19th, we finally get the shelter in place, which in effect closed schools. But that first step was taken by local leadership, and the community berated the superintendent, even though 3 days later, the NBA postponed, NCAA canceled, CIF canceled. He led. Don Austin on the 9th said they weren't going to do testing because it wasn't in the best interest of students. It wasn't going to be reliable and valid. And it took almost 2 weeks more for the state to issue Executive Order 3020, which postponed state testing. So again, the message is, absent this clear direction, folks at the local level are having to make decisions. And I think that the big one for all of us is Executive Order 2620, which is the 4 pillars, where the governor said, I'm going to hold you harmless for paying your employees. We're going to make sure that your pay is guaranteed. But we need you to do 3 things for, if you include paying them. 1, provide high quality education. 2, serve meals. And 3, care for your students. But with no clear direction on how to do that, and no provisions or relief in collective bargaining, which made it tough for folks to implement these plans. And still today, weeks and weeks later, there are folks that haven't started their distance learning plans because they don't have agreement, or they've started them and they're only volunteering to provide those 3 services, even though that pay is guaranteed. If we're about equity, if we're about serving 6.3 million students, their academic, social, emotional needs, then we've got to do better. We're going to need the state to step up in that regard. And we're going to need schools like USC, leaders like Dr. Gothold, and groups like InnovateEd to support our leaders as they make these tough decisions.
Thank you, Wes. A follow-up question would be, have you in the history of California seen such local control exercised over the basic functions of K-12 education?
Yeah, never. Not even close. Not even close. And when we say local, we mean right down to the district level, because in some counties there's more fluid leadership where they're not really defining it as a county. We have other counties that get together and they kind of collaborate. They think through these things. They share resources. I've never seen anything like this. And what's concerning about that is I've never seen times as threatening as these. So we're seeing more local decision making, more pressure to make decisions in an age where there's a lack of clarity, there's an uncertainty, and there's certainly a fear in the country about where we're headed.
Thank you very much, Wes. This next question goes to Paul Gothold. Dr. Gothold, school districts will face new challenges when schools reopen in the fall. How do you foresee district and school leaders shaping strategies for this next normal, if you want to use that word, in education? You're muted, Dr. Gothold.
My apologies. What a loaded question. How much time do I have? Well, you know, first and foremost, it needs to be said, Wes, you know, we are all grateful and appreciative that you're in the role that you are to advocate on behalf of all of the school districts and administrators. And we know that you don't just advocate on behalf of administrators. You're doing the work on behalf of all school officials, whether they're teachers, classified, and our parents. So, you know, we appreciate that very much. And And to the Rossier School of Education, Dr. Cash and everyone, thanks for allowing us to spend some time with you today and carrying this just incredible message. And Jay, we know that you're at the forefront in the think tanks and areas around supporting districts and helping us out. So just pleasure to be here. The question itself, how much time do I have? I believe in the chat in the notes box, there's a planning guide that we have created in our office. And as a county office of education, we really see our role and function is to do whatever it takes to support and guide our districts. And we do that in collaboration with them. And this planning guide and assumption guide really is just based on the new normal, if you will, that we're living under today. We continuously say that schools are not closed. Learning continues. Our educational programs continue, albeit through distance learning. And the way that we're defining distance learning so that we don't exclude children is that simply our teachers and kids are in different places. They're just not housed in the same facility. So we want to make sure that we're sensitive to the fact that we know that there's 80% of our kids in San Diego County, or somewhere around that mark, have access to some of the things that Wes was talking about. When we talk about connectivity, devices, things of that nature. Sadly, in that same vein, in that same characteristic, that includes cell phones. And so a lot of the learning opportunities that we talk about, there's still another population of students that will still not have access. So what we've worked with our districts very closely about in making sure that we double down on how are we providing educational supports to our kids who don't have connectivity, while at the same time we're really accelerating our efforts to work with our local providers to make sure we get the devices in the hands of kids, and that what Wes had just talked about, the big wins in the legislature and the governor making that commitment to close that digital divide, it's going to help, but it's still not there. And so we have a lot of work to do in that area. When you talk about reopening our buildings, we know there's going to be a lot of trepidation, a lot of fear that's going to exist for quite some time. And quite frankly, this thing has not gone away. Even when we flatten the curve and do all of those things that we've talked about, we're 12 to 18 months away from a vaccine, which means we are going to live under some modified condition for 12 to 18 months. So what is school going to look like? And really, we've started to put this planning guide and assumptions and recommendations just from our presence in the Emergency Operations Center here at the county, where there are daily meetings and briefings. And then we take that information, bring it back to our cabinet, where we have daily cabinet meetings, and with our expanded cabinet to make sure that there's a confluence of efforts and a consistent message within the county of how we guide our districts. So the things that I've stated pretty regularly about what we have to consider is, number one, we know that a lot of parents aren't going to bring their kids back to our schools, even when our buildings become open. There is going to be a desire amongst our community. We have heard this over and over. The parents want to continue to keep their kids at home. So when we talk about the distance learning platform, this is not temporary. This is not a temporary solution. These need to be viable, robust, high expectations, deep learning that is a continual platform, because we know for a fact that a lot of our kids are not going to come back. And we also talked about what does that look like because according to our Department of Health, those measures around social and physical distancing have to be in place in our schools, in the addition of face coverings. That is what they are saying today. If we were to open schools, those measures have to be in place. Well, I'm a former high school principal and teacher. That's extraordinarily different. And that's not how the human condition operates. The kids and the spirit and everything that goes along with a high school will look immensely different. It may resemble more like college. We are talking to our folks about what does your school community look like with 20% of the kids there, 50% of the kids there at any given time. And how do you build structures, schedules, and learning opportunities for our children? I see a real emphasis and rebirth of like this concept of resource centers, of independent study taking on a new life, where kids now are making appointments perhaps with their teachers, coming in a couple days a week for support. We talked about planning for, streaming lessons. Some kids are at home, some kids are at school. I think the most important thing when you read that document, it's very sobering. There's a lot of things in there that just say, wow, how is this possible? But at the end of the day, we ask our CBOs, our chief business officials, to run projections with different numbers so that we're prepared. We ask them to run projections with COLA, with 0%, with 5% less, just so we know what the outlook is going to be. It can be no different in this situation when we talk about opening schools. So when you look at that document, all of it can happen, none of it can happen, and maybe a combination of in between. But what we continuously say to our folks is that these are things that we have to keep in mind when we talk about what school buildings are going to look like. We see the potential for an increase in being a food delivery system for our communities. Honest to God, just in the short time that this thing hit, so did the jobs of many of our parents. We didn't just take on the role of feeding kids their free and reduced lunch or meals. We took on the role of feeding families. We are going to have an increase in the number of children just who qualify for free and reduced lunch. We've already seen that. And then how many more of our kids, just based on the next 12 to 18 months, are going to fall into the provisions in the McKinney-Vento or become homeless? Will there be an increase in foster youth? And what considerations do we have to make on our campuses to accommodate and support our children? So we're asking our schools to really take on this notion and not develop new systems, but just change the way our offering of and delivery systems of MTSS, of community schools, because we have a unique opportunity to provide so many different services in our schools. I will tell you, just from our agency alone, when we saw the need in this community, we collected thousands of N95 masks across our schools, 1,000 schools in this county, deployed them to our hospital and healthcare because they were facing a shortage. We just are doubling and tripling down on our efforts to do whatever it takes to help this community. So having said that, when we know that there's going to be an increase in heightened level on the social emotional aspect of our kids, not just our kids, but our families, even our employees. And as we plan to reopen school, how do we effectively deploy staff in different ways? Because the work is going to look different. There's going to be bargaining implications. And what do you do to protect students and staff when the virus is still there and you have school officials who may fall under these high-risk categories? Do we look at targeting that specific population to be delivering instruction or services in this distance learning model? Do we deploy our other staff to be on campus at different times to deliver? And we also want people to prepare for this notion of, I think, honestly, after school programs are going to take on a whole new life. They are actually the ones that we have deployed to run these pop-up childcare centers. I think that we need to look at community centers and some other resources of where school could look or academic support could exist. And it may not just be in our schools, but for those kids who don't have the luxury of coming to school maybe 2 days a week, 3 days a week, then how do we provide them and support all of their needs and really leveraging our staff who may not be full-time employees throughout the instructional day for different purposes. And so all of this will inevitably look very different. And I think at the end of the day, what I continuously tell our folks in our districts is, as we look at what this new normal is going to be, this isn't just a short-term solution. This is a long-term issue, and we have to be prepared for anything. So if we're not considering all of these variables, we're going to be caught off guard. And the one thing we do know that did occur once this pandemic hit, some of our districts who had not made that leap into one-to-ones and digital learning were a little bit flat-footed, and they're struggling a little bit more. So at least if we have the guidance, at least if we have the considerations that we all need to collectively think about when opening schools, it just means that we'll be better prepared.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gothold. And for all the attendees, the document that he's speaking about will be emailed to each of you individually so that you can have your own copy. It's a tremendous planning tool. And what I hear Dr. Gothold say is that flexibility and being nimble in the post-COVID-19 world is going to be essential. Our next question goes to Jay Westover. Jay, student equity, engagement, and support in a distance learning environment have emerged as top priorities for our schools in California. Is distance learning a COVID-19 intervention, or is it the new normal? And what's teaching and learning going to look like moving forward? And after Jay spoke, I also want to let the attendees know that Jay has written a very thought-provoking article that we'll also send to all the attendees as well about education in a post-COVID-19 world. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but Jay, you're up.
Well, thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. And I just want to mention that it's wonderful to be able to be here with USC. A lot of respect for USC. I may be a Penn State grad, but definitely am a USC supporter. And having worked with Wes and ACSA over the years, knowing that Wes, you oversee the largest administrative organization in the country, I think the guidance you put forth and the work you're doing is going to have a great impact of the nation. And I respect a lot of superintendents, but I'd say Dr. Gothold, you're like #1 on my list. So I appreciate all that you are doing. But I want to talk about what you mentioned, Dave, but in a little bit different sense, because we did write an article that was called Moving into the Next Normal. But I think that maybe instead of talking about the unknowns, we could talk about the knowns. So looking at the past, present, and future. So in the last 12 years, we've come to realize that when you look at school districts or school sites, there's really 3 big factors at play, and that's culture, capacity, and coherence. So as we've come to understand how to move through this pandemic, we paid a lot of attention to what's the culture of the school district or schools, what's the capacity and what's the coherence. And what we're noticing is these are 3 very limiting or accelerating factors. For example, we know some districts have very limiting MOUs. It's really a symptom of the level of shared leadership they might have across their district, kind of restrictive. Other school districts really don't have MOUs, and people are just engaged in teaching and learning in a very successful manner as well as they can at the moment. And the idea of culture being more about shared leadership, and the idea of capacity being about really understanding how to engage students in rigorous tasks, all plays out to, I think, this question right now. If we were to look at what's happening in the current pandemic and pay attention to the culture that's emerging, the capacity we really have at the moment, and whether or not we have coherence, I think we're going to get a light as to what it might look like to move into what this next normal is. For example, we work with and support some school districts that had to start from a packet modality. They didn't have a distance learning mode. They had to move into packets, and then they had to move into distance learning. And then I know other districts that probably 70% of their kids did not have one-to-one devices. So there's deployment of devices. 70% of kids never had used a device, but now they're doing distance learning. So there's what I think John Hattie has mentioned. There's variability and there's variance. And the thing that I think we should all be aware of is we knew there was variability in schools, but now that variability is being seen by students and parents in their homes. So how we approach this, I think, matters not just from what teaching and learning looks like, but are we actually thinking about that variability? Because I know that in my household, I have a senior in high school, junior in high school, and a sophomore in college. Well, my sophomore in college is online, really effective learning, doing well. My other 2 students, it's not quite the same. So here's what I might suggest moving forward is variability existed. However, the variability from John Hattie's research talked about in a district, it's 0.36, but within a school, it's 0.64. So if we know the challenge is not going to be necessarily how a school district does the work, but how a school site does the work. And so I think we may have in the past had principals that really weren't strong learning leaders. They were a little bit more of a manager, and they weren't instructional leaders. And I think this is probably causing them to shift how they approach the work, because they're going to have to become very strong instructional leaders and able to lead the learning process. So we are now in, as we look at the phases, first phase that we wrote about was resolve. It was amazing. I think, Wes, you mentioned it well. California was able to have so much resolve that within a short period of time, we turned the lights off in our school districts and moved into distance learning. We had the support from the state to do it. A lot of resolve in place. And then I know, Paul, you mentioned the idea of mental health and resilience. I notice a lot of resilience happening. So people are resilient during these challenging times. But now we're in a return mode, which means distance learning is on. And it also means that we need to reimagine learning. So I'm noticing 4 things happening right now. One is I would call prescription. There's this sense of, this is the way I want you to do it. This is the limitations to it. Do it exactly like this. Give every kid 1 hour of learning per day and 1 office hour per day. Very limiting, very conformed. And then I'm also seeing what might be fragmentation. It's like all men and women for themselves. It's kind of random acts of greatness, and there isn't much direction. But I'm also noticing coherence, where there are principals who are meeting with their teachers every Friday. They're talking about instructional priorities. They're talking about delivery models. They're sharing best practices. And every week they're getting better. So those schools are going to be successful. So if it was going to be next school year, I might go back to John Hattie one more time, because I read the research on the hurricanes in the United States and fires across the world, and there was very little impact on student learning from these natural disasters. What they noticed was it wasn't the impact of learning, it was the impact of what teachers were doing in the learning. So here's the unfortunateness. The effect size of distance learning is about 0.15. However, if you use it from a interactive video standpoint, like we're doing right now, it jumps up to about 0.6. So unless you're doing interactive communication with students in this way, you're not having an impact, because distance learning has a low impact. So 3 things to consider moving forward. It's a question. Have you decided on what you want your instructional framework to be as a school district or school site? And what that means is, we're going to have to think about curriculum, instruction, assessment, and learning environment much differently. We don't want every teacher to go about this independently without much sense of what to do. But districts and principals and teachers who say, what is our instructional framework going to look like? How can we imagine it? Doing it with teachers, with principals, so that over the summer and the next school year, everyone has a sense of calm about, this is how we're framing teaching and learning. This is our modality. This is our process. This is how we're going to work together. I think districts with the strongest instructional frameworks will move into a very strong teaching and learning mode. The second one probably would be precision of pedagogy. I would say that probably Dylan Williams said it best. Dylan Williams' comment about a month ago was, in the United States, we have some of the best learning in the world. And in the United States, we have some of the worst learning in the world. What the phrase was is, learning in the United States is variable, bottom line. So how do you develop precision of pedagogy with a new instructional framework? And what I noticed in both Wes's conversation, which was spot on, and Paul's conversation, was maybe the conversation was about structures. It wasn't about pedagogical approaches. So I think if we focus too much on the structure of social distancing, how to look at the schedule of how kids come back too much, we're not going to start having these pedagogical conversations, which probably need to start now, about how do we build precision of pedagogy in a new way, and start to have that with teachers. And I'll just leave with one last thought. We know the highest effect size in learning isn't about distance learning. It's not about seat time. It's about collective teacher efficacy. And what that really means is a principal with teachers are working together to decide what impact do I want on student learning, how is learning going to look, how do I know if students are learning, how do I make adjustments if students aren't learning as well as I'd like, and how do I take that knowledge that I've gained collectively to figure out how to improve together. I'm a little concerned that we might want to move in this with all the right answers, but if we give space to principals and teachers to develop the efficacy they need, I think they're come up with some amazing solutions. It's going to look different in Palo Alto, because I know Don Austin. It's going to look a little different there than it might be in LAUSD or in Glendale or maybe in Room of the World. That's going to look different. I think the three things that are going to be the same is they all need an instructional framework. They all have to talk about precision and pedagogy, and they all have to decide how to create that efficacy in a delivery model that's very different. So I mentioned those three things because what I notice is those are the conversations that are starting to happen with those more coherent districts, and the other districts who are not very coherent are talking about structure and mitigation and, and things that are more logistical in nature. So I'm hoping that we see district leaders and principals rise to the occasion of talking about teaching and learning, but don't do it in a manner in which we're telling teachers how to teach. But it's got to be about exploration and innovation, and just, unleashing the potential of what it could look like without the barriers of classroom walls. The thing that I was most excited about is I had a teacher I recently talked to who, when this started, she was so frustrated and she felt like she wanted to retire. And now, after 3 weeks of this, she said, I don't think I want to go back to my old teaching mode. I think I can do blended learning. I think I can make it so learning doesn't stop for kids. And I've learned so much now that I don't think I go back to my old ways. So I guess my last question is, how are we capturing these really good lessons learned and then leverage them to moving into the future? So.
Thank you, Jay. Fantastic. I want to let both Wes and Paul weigh in on what might teaching and learning look like moving forward. So Wes, what are your thoughts on that? Thank you, Jay.
The only thing I'll add, because I thought that was well done, is what you started with. This gives us a chance to rethink how we do schools in the future and gives us a chance once and for all to eliminate those access, opportunity, and achievement gaps, the digital divide. So what can we learn in this process? It helps us support our students who need the most support moving forward. And if that's in a virtual environment, in a blended environment, whatever, wouldn't it be nice if support for our students never stopped? That 24/7, 365, our students were supported and cared for and educated in some form or fashion. Then, I think, and only then, are we going to be able to overcome those societal ills that have plagued us in this country since its inception.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Dr. Gothold.
Yeah, so Jay, there's a ton of work being done in this area, and from our office perspective, just a couple of things. And one, that cohesion you talk about, coherence you talked about, we are adamant about making sure that those student outcomes are in place throughout our schools. And you could see those footprints of collective learning amongst our teachers and high expectations for our kids. And one of the things that we talked about when it was really easy for some of our folks to get trapped in, wow, how are we going to do this now? And it's just blossomed into just an extraordinary opportunity to actually think about how we could accelerate the learning, particularly for our underserved kids. So those systems of practice, when you talk about alignment, when you talk about the fidelity of instruction, are happening not just for our own schools as a county, but we have a C&I group that meets with all of our districts. So our district's learning plans, our distance learning plans are all shared amongst the districts as a county. The other thing that I want to speak to around this area is that, there's a stark reality that some of our kids still don't have connectivity and devices. And so what we've demanded from our own staff, but also from the districts, is to make sure that we have contingencies in place to continue learning of our most vulnerable kids. We've opened, and unfortunately, I don't think the paper pencil is so much of an option because they haven't made the migration into digital learning, as sometimes it is. That's the only way we have a chance to reach some of our kids. We have 19 Native American reservations in San Diego County that are completely closed off. Some of them don't have any access to Wi-Fi. We have communities where the only access to Wi-Fi they had was the phones, and through job loss, now that is gone as well. So we have set up systems and structures to ensure that our framework of learning, our framework of our pedagogy, everything else that we do with our kids continues, whether it's digital or not. And so until we fully break apart this digital divide, we still have to have some of those contingencies in place so that our kids have access to our teachers. The most important thing we can do is make contact with our kids, particularly during this time with our underserved kids, to make sure that we are connecting with them on a daily basis, not just for academics and resources and support, but also just to see how they're doing and helping them with anxiety and everything else that comes along with this.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gothold. And speaking of that, how are the social, emotional, mental health needs of our student staff and leaders being addressed now and in the future?
Yeah, that's, one of the things that we talked about a few weeks ago, there was this ramp up in, just domestic violence, increased suicide. I can't, this is difficult. We lost a young lady last night that just came out of one of our alcohol and rehab facilities, residential facilities. And this is a real issue. And it's something that we think is not just going to go away, but that the economic conditions as they are and the impact it's had on our families, particularly those that have lost life, have even put more constraints on our kids. So we did everything that every other county would do, and that's just leverage all of our CBOs, our counselors, do virtual sessions, our mental health agencies are there to support our kids. But what we thought that even with all of that, it just wasn't enough. And so a couple of weeks ago, our mental health team developed resources for our teachers. We want to make sure that we can do this 2 or 3 times a week, even if it's 5 to 10 minutes a day, just making sure that we have some social emotional learning that's delivered through another adult and not just these check-ins. We've also, developed a script for our educators and our classified after-school providers, mental health therapists, counselors, that just goes down the list and talks about, particularly for our most vulnerable kids, how are you doing with your academics? Did you get your work done? Do you need support in this area? Do you need food? It just goes down a litany of just really taking stock and a temperature and a pulse on how the kid is doing emotionally at home during this time. I suspect this is one of the things we have to consider that's going to just amplify, and we're going to have to just, like Jay said, the best thing that's coming out of this is it's just forcing some of the most creative and innovative conversation and solution that I've been a part of. And just watching the manner in which all of our staff and our districts and team leaders and teachers have just come together to do whatever it takes. Man, I am so hopeful. I am excited about the opportunity that's going to come out of this on the other side, that's only going to benefit our kids, because there's just an extraordinary amount of attention to making sure that we meet their needs. So,
thank you. And Jay, just so that you know, one of the great things about Rossier School of Education is it produces leaders like Paul Gothold, just as an FYI. So I'd like both Jay and Wes to weigh into the social, emotional, and mental health needs of our student, staff, and leaders I know that we really focused on the, setting up distance learning and trying to prevent learning loss and accelerate learning. But if we don't pay attention to the other very important part of how kids get engaged, we'll never get them there. So your thoughts on that question? How are we going to address that in the future moving forward? We'll start first with you, Jay.
Yeah, I would say that what I've noticed the districts, at least we're working with, are definitely shifting into less of a, for district leaders, less of a nuts and bolts and management conversation, and shifting into almost modeling what it looks like to learn, as a leader. And I'm noticing that it's lowering the affect and allowing for more vulnerable conversations to happen. So I think that I'm seeing districts, creating a more vulnerable environment where these conversations need to be had, because in the past, sometimes district leaders and principals didn't want to talk as if they didn't know what to do or they're having troubles. But now it's, I think, becoming a little bit more of a norm of let's discuss the challenges, seek solutions. I think from a teacher perspective and a school perspective, we've always done social emotional learning, but I think that we've always done it from the standpoint of programs. And like Paul mentioned, I'm not sure that we've ever really equipped people to do it well as an individual. Rather, it's always been, we're going to buy this and follow it, but I'm not sure it turned into like the human side of social emotional learning. So I don't necessarily have an answer for it, but I think it's got to be more humanistic in nature. It's got to be more authentic, engaging, and vulnerable, authentic conversations. And it can't be buying programs. It has to be really equipping people to be comfortable with having these conversations, sharing vulnerabilities and seeking solutions and offering support.
Thank you. Wes?
Yeah, for me, this is the question, right? This is the thing we need to be thinking about right now, the mental wellness, the overall wellness of our communities. And Paul mentioned there are great things happening right now, and this isn't to avoid the question about professional support, but folks are reaching out and engaging all over the state. We've got teachers that are doing video chats with their students. I just saw a teacher do a bit from Hamilton where he did his lesson to the music of Hamilton. And I watched it and I couldn't understand a thing he was teaching, but I loved watching it and it made me smile and I brought my family in. That's connecting. That's making sure that students, as they go through all of these unknowns and as they have their graduation skipped or done virtually, as they have their college admission interviews done virtually, as they have their dance performances done by themselves in a room on a camera, the more we can do to connect them and make them feel a little more normal, the better. And it's happening. We had a group of teachers and a superintendent in Los Molinos do a parade throughout the community. And this is a very rural community. And they painted their pickup trucks and they put balloons in the windows and they drove by the house of every student in the district and honked their horns and told them they cared about them. They looked forward to seeing them when school started. And I thought what was really cool about it, in one of the photos, there was a senior citizen that was out at the corner in her walker watching the parade go by, and she's waving. The message is we all need this support. And I'll just end with this. We talk a lot about the needs of our students, as we should, and those folks providing resources to our students, our teachers, our classified, our food service. But I got to tell you, all the leaders on the phone right now, don't forget your own wellness. You can't lead if you're not well. You can't make a difference if you don't show up. It doesn't benefit you to be selfless to the extent that you don't prioritize your wellness. You too need to be well. And I think that's a conversation we're not having around the state. And I sure hope we do at some point.
Thank you. Well, now we're going to go to some questions by our participants. And I'm going to ask Matt DeGroosh to state the question. And then we'll go in alphabetical order. We'll give everybody an opportunity to answer the question. So that'll be Dr. Gothold will get a shot, then Dr. Smith, and then Jay, even though he's well, that's why he's going last. He's a Nittany Lion. Let's be honest about that. So, Matt, let's hear the first question.
All right. Well, I'm going to do a little bit of an alternative approach here. There's been a ton of great questions that have come through. And while you've been talking, I've been scrolling through them and trying to put them together in themes, also trying to listen to everything you've all said to see, I think you've answered some of those questions while they were being posed. And I also just want to note that we are planning follow-up webinars, so these questions are great for us as we look at other topics and what we should be addressing in those. So I apologize if we don't get to your specific question, but I would say the first main theme of questions was really about the opening of school and what is that going to look like, and questions ranging from, is that start date going to be pushed back? Are there going to be social distancing in place? What does that look like? I think there was some talk about after school activities, whether that's sports. We also had someone mention some music as well. I'll leave it at that. There were a lot of other things, but really just a major concern, a lot of questions about what does the opening of school look like, or what do you think it's going to look like? Because I don't think a lot of decisions have been made there.
So we'll go out of order here. We'll go statewide. So we'll have Wes from the state perspective, and then we'll have Paul talk about it from the school opening perspective. Wes?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Cash. I was on the phone last night with the governor's office, and they said we have absolutely had no conversations about the date of the start of the school year, because right now they're focused on getting us through this immediate crisis. Flattening the curve, providing the infrastructure we need to account for loss of learning now, and then get ready for the year. I mentioned this notion of a trial balloon. When the governor had that EO of a week ago and said, when schools reopen, they're going to look very differently, and they could look like, and he mentioned 3 alternatives. He was riffing then. That wasn't in the notes. He had read something about other countries and what they were doing. He reads a ton. He remembers it all. And so he was just talking. But what it did was it started a firestorm all over the state, because people are like, well, holy cow. So is that a mandate? Is this another EO that's more of guidance or a wish list? Or is this what's going to happen? I can tell you, he wasn't saying this is how it's going to happen. There isn't a date that's set. And the good news is, there are groups like ours and other associations. We just convened with task force today to look at and study over the next 3 weeks. What are the options for reopening? And we're using Paul Gothold's work and the work of others in other states. What are the options? What might it look like? What timeline could we use? And we're going to use variable, including opening, closing, opening again. And then what do we have to address to get there with funding and waivers and transportation and food service? All those things you have to consider when you're going to make these decisions. So no, the date hasn't been set. They're not even looking that far into the future right now, but we are in the field, and we're going to have some recommendations for them. So instead of them convening a group in months to figure it out, we're going to let the experts in the space figure it out and tell them what they should do.
Great. Dr. Gothold.
Yeah, just to complement, I think what Wes was talking about, you know, a lot of the things that we put in that planning guide and assumptions was just for districts and schools to think through what that could look like. You know, one of the things that we didn't do here was announce or be time bound by anything. And that included the rest of the school year. You know, no one is suffering more right now than our seniors in so many different ways, to not have the opportunity to participate in so many things that we remember and were afforded ourselves when we were seniors in high school. And so we use the term, you know, our buildings are closed until further notice, but school is still in session. Because a lot of this has to do with, because I remember seeing just so many dates being thrown out there. This county's coming back in April. This county's closed till May. And I just said, this is insane. No one has a crystal ball as to when this thing is when we're going to flatten the curve and we're going to have, you know, a reduction in the number of cases. We're not health experts. We just don't know. And if there is a possibility where there is this soft opening in our communities where our health department says, yes, it's okay to convene this many people, guess what? I'm going to bring our seniors back because they deserve that. Even if it's for one day, I'm going to bring them back onto the campus, even in small groups, to give them some type of an experience. But I think the best we can take away from this is we simply don't know. I have districts here that start July, the regular school year. Their summer school starts in June, but guess what? They'll be prepared, whether their doors are open physically or not. That's why it is so important to have a plan in place that no matter what the conditions are, you can fully execute. That planning guide has a work group of 35 people that are currently putting together a template and a resource guide that you just populate in order to check the box on all the things we have to think about to open school. And so whether that happens in July, August, September, who knows? We may be shut down for 6 to 8 months. I don't know. It's going to be up to the governor's orders and the state of public health as to when they say, yes, it's going to be okay. But if we plan for everything and all of our contingencies, we're going to be fine.
Thank you. Westover.
Yeah, so I would say that what we've learned from the past is that regardless of when schools open, if you have a process in place where district leaders with principals, also with teachers are having these conversations that both was mentioned by Wes and Paul, you're going to be successful. So I guess the thing that we're doing now in support of these efforts is we are meeting with cabinets, extended cabinets and principals to kind of reimagine what learning could look like. What are the multiple scenarios? What's the common thread? So we're not getting stuck on what's the scenarios, but in every scenario of learning, what's consistent? Because if we can plan for the thing that's consistent, we can be successful across all scenarios. And the other thing that I've heard from districts I've worked with that say they feel good about where they are now is they recognize the strength of their principals and their school leadership teams, because they feel their schools are really being successful because they have a principal who's able to lead the work, and regardless of what scenario happens, they're going to be capable of navigating it. But more importantly, they've developed teacher leadership to the point where teachers are definitely at the table and they're shaping the work with the school and with the principal. So I guess my only advice is it's not about the date. It's about what are you doing now to bring together district leaders and principals and teachers to reimagine learning, create contingency plans that are driven more by the school, because we know a district is not going to be able to have the bandwidth to work with 4 or 400 schools. It's going to have to be site driven. And I would hope that districts are beginning to emerge from the chaos and starting to put these plans in place, but doing it with principals and considering how teachers can be part of the process. That's the approach that we've taken currently.
Thank you. Matt, what's the next group of questions?
So Dave, I think we'll probably have time for one more sort of theme of questions. And I don't know if everyone will have a chance to chime in as well, because we're almost about the 5-minute mark. But it seemed like the next group of questions really dealt about learning gaps and how that's going to be addressed when students return, whether it's from not receiving grades or providing teachers with additional support, because there was a lot of concern in the questions about moving to the online teaching and distance learning mode. Learning has suffered, and so how is that being accounted for in the return plans for schools and districts?
Great. Well, we'll start with Wes Smith again.
I think one of the big topics, I just mentioned it a second ago, is loss of learning. What do we do, especially for some of our neediest students? But again, for sake of time, I think this is the golden opportunity we have as we look at all the things that work right now. It gives us an idea of how we can accelerate and remediate, how we can really make a difference for those students. One of the things we're looking at as we start the school year next year is how do we assess the loss of learning, and then what kinds of practices, and Jay, you mentioned a bunch of them and they're right on, but how do we assess where they are how they've fallen off, and then how do we get them back to where they need to be so that they're not harmed for years and years to come. Not a part of this question, but someone asked in the question bar about the safety of teachers and students. And I would say whenever anyone talks about what reopening looks like and mitigating that loss of learning, the first question is it safe for students? Is it safe for staff? And how do we make sure it is? So that absolutely is true. And I can tell you these conversations are being had with labor and management at the state level.
So Matt, I hear you telling us that we're out of time.
One more point.
No, we have, Paul, go ahead.
Okay, go Paul. Like to hear from you.
You know, what Jay talked about earlier is spot on too. I mean, if we do this right, there shouldn't be learning loss. It's about doubling and tripling down on how we are going to make sure that in this day and era, in this new normal, how our most vulnerable kids are going to be successful. So all of the things that we know that's backed by research can happen through distance learning, whether it's online, paper, pencil, formative assessments, and how we track the progress of our kids, respond to our kids' needs. But I also think summer presents an exciting opportunity, you know, to introduce kids to, and really calling it that, accelerate learning, and introduce kids to the next grade level over the summer. I know there's some financial implications to that, but it gives the adults an opportunity to set up these learning teams about better delivery methods under these new circumstances, what Jay was talking about. I don't think there's anything more important than principals and instructional teams working together to develop what's best for kids and to make sure that we have high expectations for all of our students, and then how we're measuring that, and then how we're responding to that to make sure that our most vulnerable kids get what they need and deserve every day.
Thank you.
I know we're out of time, Dave. I'll just mention one sentence, basically. Let's not forget that the research points that collective teacher efficacy effect size is 1.6. That's equivalent to 3 years of academic growth in 1 year. So if we really can develop the strength in a school of how a principal works with teachers to get to that point of efficacy, there not only won't be loss of learning, there'll be gain of learning. So if we shift that around, you know, to the potential, I think the opposite could happen if we do it well.
Great. I want to thank our panel today. Wes Smith, the Executive Director of ACSA. I concur, we're very fortunate to have him in that spot advocating for children, over 6 million children in California. Paul Gothold, a real shining light in the County Superintendent's office. Thank you so much for all the work you do, not just for San Diego County, but for being a leader in the state. And Jay Westover, even though you're a Nittany Lion, you held up pretty well with the Trojan family today. And really want to thank you for the work that you do in districts across California. Just great stuff and keeping our children at the forefront of where they need to be. You know, for all of you that are participants, our doctoral program at USC is a great place for people to continue the conversation, learn how to become scholar practitioners. And we have both an online and on the ground program at USC right now for those who do not have their doctorate and should be members of the Trojan family. And then I'd ask all of you to look out for our next event, hopefully sometime within the next couple of weeks, when we're gonna come back together again, and this time we'll listen to school site leaders and classroom teachers describe how they're making it work for the students in the classes that they have. And finally, I'd like to say thanks to Matt DeGroosh, one of the best Trojans we know, for putting this all together today. And Matt has a few parting comments.
Thank you, Dave, for those kind words, and thank you for pulling together the panel. I know I put you to work on this, and I appreciate seeing it come to fruition. I thought it was excellent today, and I give my thanks to the speakers as well. And thank you to all the attendees for spending time with us today. I know these are crazy times, and we're being pulled in a lot of different directions, but a lot of you logged on and stayed on for the entirety, so we appreciate that. When you close out of the webinar today, you'll be sent to a short feedback survey, and I say it's short. Please take a moment to share your thoughts on this webinar as well as ideas you have for future webinars. So this concludes today's webinar. I hope everyone continues to stay safe and healthy, and remember to keep fighting on.